And if I had to pick one insight that I think is important and worth taking seriously, it's the distributist claim about the relationship between ownership and liberty. Now, we have to spend a little bit of time talking about that word liberty, since it's not going to mean the same thing to somebody who's rooted in Catholic social teaching as it is going to mean to a more orthodox libertarian. So just for full disclosure, I do say this in the preface of the book, but I myself am a pretty orthodox libertarian. Nonetheless, I found it very interesting and fascinating delving into these ideas. Liberty to Belloc and Chesterton, and liberty to those who follow Catholic social teaching, is not merely absence of interference. There's an element of that, provided that the interference is coming unjustly from an authority that does not adhere to the common good and interfering in a lower order community in that way. But liberty has a necessarily intrinsic relationship to human flourishing. It means that you have the means and the ability to do as you ought, to fulfill your God-given duties. And so when we look at liberty that way and think about distributist freedom in that way, we realize that their claims about ownership, the incentives that come with ownership, the informational properties of a widely dispersed private property economy, are such that you're really going to be able to maintain institutions that respect human dignity and human freedom, as Catholic social teaching describes it, if there's widespread access to productive property. That's the central distributist claim that I think has important implications for our institutions and political debates today, since ownership and the cares that come with it is not something that really enters into our policy debates anymore. The closest thing to it would be the push for widespread home ownership, by going back to the Bush administration, right? Everybody should own a home, everybody should be in a house. A lot of people have reservations with the way that worked out given the 2008 financial crisis, but the distributists aren't really talking about one specific asset, a home. They're talking about when you actually own the factors of production that you use to earn your livelihood, how does that change that you view your relationship to the fellow people in your community? How does that affect your perspective on the world as a citizen? How does that affect how we deliberate with each other as equals in a community of equals? There's a whole lot of really interesting stuff that you can say for that notion of ownership and for that notion of liberty as Catholic social teaching understands it. And I think that looking at it that way shows that many of the political and economic problems that we have today can be made intelligible by saying we don't really live in an ownership society anymore, if we ever did.
Right. Well, I mean, there's a lot to be said about this, and like you, I found that to be the most compelling point, and particularly their conception of ownership and what kind of ownership they're talking about. And what I found when reading about Belloc's thoughts in particular, despite my kind of earlier in life, my suspicion of distributism, I found it pretty consonant, of course, with the Catholic social teaching, the foundational documents of Catholic social teaching that I've been reading over the past few years, and also with some social and cultural critiques made by people who might describe themselves today as post-liberal, and I fall sort of vaguely within in that camp. I would maybe describe myself as like a Leonine post-liberal, something like that. I want to look at a couple of big picture things to sort of clarify this discussion of ownership and why it's important. One thing you mentioned in the book early on is when we're talking about common good capitalism, there's a problem with thinking of it in primarily economics terms or as like a third way between capitalism and socialism, which I believe I want to say John Paul II in Centesimus Annus actually even says that Catholic social teaching is not a third way. And particularly that we don't want common good capitalism to be focused on material comfort rather than human dignity. And like you, I'm very suspicious of things like universal basic income for that reason, despite not being a libertarian. And I think that there can be something of a myopic attitude towards the effects that certain policies will inevitably have on human dignity when you're just focused on material comfort. So that's kind of one aspect of the big picture problem that can clarify what we're talking about here.
Yes, I think that's right. So when you start to look at these social arrangements, do we want capitalism? Do we want socialism? Do we want some sweet spot between the two? The temptation is to focus on things like income inequality, consumption inequality, right? Figuring out how those sorts of things work. That's actually a very sterile way of looking at it. If you actually subscribe to the rich notions of human flourishing that come from Catholic social teaching, those really can't be your evaluative standards. Right? It comes with the general problem of loving humanity in the abstract without actually doing good to any actual flesh and blood people. That's
Hmm.
not the way that these social systems are supposed to work. It's not necessarily, when you look at income inequality, for example, that's not necessarily a problem, but neither is it necessarily justified. You have to look at how the actual incomes in question are being generated. It's not exactly a great stretch to say that different productive activities can yield different incomes in line with the values of the citizens whom you're catering to. That's not particularly controversial. But in just looking at inequality for its own sake, oh, you have more, you have less, therefore you should have more, that doesn't get at the heart of the issue, which is the dignity of work, the act of creation, of acting on property in a way that creates value, these fundamental things that come with what it means to be human, an almost artistic exercise. That's actually central to some of Thomas Aquinas's arguments for private property. This idea
Hmm.
that we have private ownership, so each person, each household really, has a sphere of activity which is its own, so they can practice their talents and develop their virtues, where virtues just means ethical habits. And so we need to reorient our way of thinking if we care about these issues away from the popular narratives of, again, can you consume as much as your neighbor? Do we want to increase this
Right.
transfer payment? If all you're doing is giving somebody a check, that does not comport to dignity and that does not comport to security. A government transfer payment is just as precarious as a job that might be outsourced.